Hey everyone, welcome back to Tactical Magic. This is Molly Mandelberg, your host, and we are talking about books and transformation today. First, we're going to talk about what it's like to bring a book to life, what it's like to be a writer, making a book come to life or allowing a book to come to life more so. And we're also talking about how we find our wholeness within our wounding, which is something I'm very passionate about. And I have an expert with me on the line today who's also passionate about this. So hang tight for just a second. We'll be right back. It's not just about mastering technology. It's not just about brand or messaging. It's not just about making more money. It's about showing up in a big way so your people can find you. This is about bringing your most wild and authentic self into the hustle and grind. Welcome to Tactical Magic, a business strategies podcast for the warrior goddess entrepreneur. All right. So Jenny Brav was born and raised in Paris, France, to American parents who instilled in her a love of words, a sensitivity to the human condition, and a passion for travel. I feel like I got some of those same things from my parents. Her debut dual timeline novel, The Unbroken Horizon, was published in August of this year, and it brings together themes that are close to her heart, especially how we find wholeness within our wounding. And the book has already won a number of awards, including being a finalist in 2 categories for the 2023 Best Book Awards. So I'm very excited to geek out about The Unbroken Horizon, and welcome to the show, Jenny. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And yeah, I feel like we have a lot to talk about, a lot of similar interests. So
Yeah,
it's awesome.
absolutely. So first
Yeah.
off, congratulations for bringing your book to life, for publishing it, getting it out into the world. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can see the cover on the screen. For those of you not watching on YouTube, head over to Wild Hearts Rise Up on YouTube and maybe catch us on video for this one. So first, just tell us a little bit about what it was like for you to choose that you were going to write a book, bring this book to life, and then release the book out into the world. Like, what was that experience like for you?
I mean, first of all, I never chose to write a book. Like it definitely chose me. I don't think, I mean, by the time I realized I was writing a book, I was like, oh no, I don't know if I can do this. It's a lot. But it was like the first channeled vision came probably in about 2011, and it was concurrent to me having left a decade of working, doing humanitarian work in conflict zones. I moved to the Bay Area in 2010 to study holistic healing. And in one of the workshops, I got a vision of myself but not really myself, and as a young Black woman in a forest, and just felt terrified and like nauseated and saw like torches and white hoods, and it came to me in 2 different settings, and it was so disturbing that I just sat down and said, okay, who are you? And channeled like the broad outline of this young woman's life who ended up being the historical character in my dual timeline story, Maggie.
Mhm.
And so it really started with her, and I wasn't intending to write a novel. I was just like, okay, who is this? And I just had to get her story on paper and got the broad outline of her story. And then later I had the the thought of this other character who was a humanitarian nurse who kind of brought together my experience doing humanitarian work, but also my sisters who worked for Doctors Without Borders. And in fact, the opening chapters in South Sudan were more inspired by her experiences. And so, yeah, by the time I realized I was writing a book, it actually freaked me out a little bit because I was also establishing my practice. I had to pause for over a year. I was like, I can't write a novel at the same time as establishing a practice. It's too much. And then when I reopened the door, it was really Maggie who like was like, okay, you're never letting me go. And even though in the novel itself, it's alternating chapters, once after I'd kind of written the first 10 chapters alternatingly, then paused for over a year, and then met some people from a writers group I'd been part of. We started meeting again as soon as I reopened the door, she wouldn't let me go. And I actually wrote her story first. And it was partially a lot of the broad outlines really felt channeled. Like she wanted me to tell her story. It wasn't really me choosing, like sitting down and saying, I'm going to write a book. No, it
Mhm.
wasn't that. And then the rest of her story was informed by a lot of research I was doing into the time period. Once I like understood which time period I was working with, I was looking each year, especially in terms of the racial violence that was happening at the time and the anti-lynching movement and how she fit into that. And so I was kind of weaving what I knew of her story into the historical context of the time. And so then when she was done, I started writing Sarah, who was the contemporary humanitarian nurse's story, who has a lot more of me in it. And she was actually my problem child for a long time. I had a much, for me, from my perspective, I know it's, there, for a lot of people, me writing a young Black woman's story is problematic, and I get that. But for me, writing a story that had much more of my autobiographical, like kind of broad outlines of my life and things that had inspired me, even though it didn't feel like it was my story per se, like I had a harder time writing her. And I did much more rewriting of her story, like when I started writing with an editor after I'd done the first kind of rough draft, which took me years because I was writing one chapter a month. My writing group would meet once a month. I was writing one chapter a month, like really on weekends whenever I had free time, because I was also establishing this healing practice. All of my holidays, pretty much like 2 or 3 weeks a year, were writing holidays. So it took me 7 or 8 years to maybe 7 years to write the rough draft. And then I spent a couple years working with editors, learning about the craft of writing, which I hadn't really known beforehand, even though I come from a pretty literary family, but hadn't studied writing. Um, yeah. So, and then
Very organic, it sounds
publishing.
like, and tapped on the shoulder to allow a story to come through you, which is can be thrilling and also can be uncomfortable of wanting to do it justice, wanting to make sure that you get the right things on the page for sure. I love that. I love that that was your experience. And I also love that you are acknowledging that some of it didn't come from you, it came through you. I think as a writer, it's actually such a relief to take the sort of ego part out and say, I'm allowing this to come out rather than I'm creating this and this is coming from me. It can be really liberating to figure out or allow being a channel for words to come through. I think a lot of the time when I'm writing copy, especially for my clients, that it's coming from a channeled place, that I sort of get the gist of where we're trying to go and then open something up rather than squeeze something out. And it is just a different sensation. I feel really fortunate too, because I was raised by my mom is a professional writer and has been for 40, 50 years now. Sorry, mom, if you're listening to date you in such a way, but the majority of her career was writing the stories of people who had passed on. And she would often be writing something new and think, oh, nobody in this one is dead. It must be coming from me. And then she'd hear a voice saying, well, I'm not alive. And then she's like, oh, okay, somebody is feeding me this story. And what a cool thing to get to be an avenue for stories that want to be told to come through. What a gift to get to be that flow, that place for that to come through.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was really important to me to, again, it was both the channeling and then grounding that in history. And I love research, and kind of my career before this was pretty research driven and academic, even though it was in the field doing humanitarian work. A lot of it was research, and I love that. And so I love combining both. And as you said, as a channel, it did feel like a responsibility, but her voice came through so clearly, and both characters had such different voices. Maggie's was so like poetic and lyrical, and Sarah's was caustic, sarcastic, like very factual, and but also softening through her journey, because they both go through journeys of transformation, which I loved. And what was interesting to me, though, having really felt like a lot of Maggie was channeled, was then coming out of the cocoon I'd been in the first phase, and then getting a lot of feedback about how maybe it would be perceived to have me as a white writer writing the story of a young Black woman, especially in the current climate, which I had so much empathy for. And so I was having to hold both these realities concurrently. And so when I was deciding whether or not it was my place to bring this out in the world, I had to ask her, and she was like, well, I gave you my story. Who are you not to? So I was like, okay, it's kind of out of my hands here as well. And that felt like the ultimate guide. Like, that's all I can really listen to. I can take everything else, and worked with sensitivity, like readers at the beginning, at the end, had an amazing, wonderful, I love her so much, Black poet editor who also like looked at Maggie's poems and the whole thing, and really we worked closely together. And for me, as you said, in some ways, knowing it wasn't mine was both a responsibility, but also took it out of a place of ego where it's like, it's not really my choice. And then it also felt like a soul journey for me. My soul was very clearly telling me, okay, like really part of this journey is for you to go through this from beginning to end, complete it, and bring it out in the world. Like, you need to birth this.
Yeah.
So I did. And I love what you said about your mom, because my father's dream was to be a writer, and that was why he moved to Paris. And my mom also independently moved to Paris, and they met there in the film translation business, which
Mm.
when my father had decided, kind of realized he might not make it as a writer, he pivoted to translating movies from French to English, writing the subtitles. They both did voiceovers. My sister and I, as kids, did voiceovers in movies, like starting at 5 for me, before I could even really read. And so I published the book on August 15th, which was because he passed when I was 8, and August 15th of this year was the 41st anniversary of his death. And so I really felt like, okay, it's not just me doing something for myself and honoring one of my dreams to be a writer, but it had really been his dream to be
Mm.
a writer. After my mom passed when I was 25, we found a box of my father's journals, which Sarah has a little bit of a similar experience in the novel, so that's a parallel with mine. And in this box were like 8 spiral notebook journals of his, starting in 1948, finishing in 1968. And so I got to really know him since he died when I was so young. I got to know him through his
Wow.
journals,
Yeah.
being a writer through his journals, because that hadn't been so prominent by the time we were born, even though he still had his old typewriter, and we'd hear it late into the night sometimes. So I really felt like, okay, this is for me, for him, for my ancestors. There's a lot about intergenerational healing in the book, and that's
Yeah.
been my journey as well. And so I
And
really
he's
felt like,
probably helping bring it to life too.
sure, yeah, I really felt, when I had actually planned on publishing it in July, August. I was like, oh, it's a dead month, not a good date to publish. And then when I realized July wasn't going to happen, and I was in meditation, and all of a sudden I felt him, and I was like, oh, I'm supposed to publish this on the date of his death, because then I'm also bringing kind of his thwarted dreams to life as
Love
well.
that. Yeah.
And a lot of Sarah's journey is also about healing from her father's death when she's young, of a sudden heart attack, and finding him, which was my sister and my experience as well. Obviously, she has some of my experiences in her. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that sense of honoring and continuing, and also finding the missing puzzle pieces out of
Yeah. in your
So
story.
yeah, the wholeness and the wounding for me, that's part of it.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. What does that mean? I feel like I could riff on what that means to me and have also written a book about that same topic. But tell
Well,
us
I
a little bit
want to.
about what's that process like, finding your wholeness within our wounding.
Um, yeah, I mean, in general, and this is me with my writer's hat, but also my healer's hat, which very much informed like both. Well, Sarah's journey comes from my own healing process, but then, her therapist, Patrick, has a lot of me in him. And so, really, whenever I'm working with someone, when I'm looking at all of, places where the wounding has disconnected these beautiful humans from their wholeness. And so I am looking at the traumas that are either their own or inherited, the coping strategies, the limiting beliefs. And within that, I'm also always seeing and reflecting back the whole beautiful, intact selves that I know that we're all here to be and shine through. So for me, like finding the wholeness in the wounding is therefore intentional rather, when things keep on happening repeatedly, which often happens for many of us until we learn to pause and listen, it's really not intended to re-traumatize us. It's intended for us to pause and really like take a moment to look into the mirroring and recognize, oh, it's just pointing to what's wanting loving attention. And when I'm able to start healing those wounded child parts, start healing the intergenerational wounding, and then any collective wounding or past lives or whatever we might believe in, like that's when it's really more about like, I think and for people who can't see me, you can't see what I'm doing with my hands. So it's almost like clearing or peeling the layers or like clearing off all the overlays of things that are not the truth of who we are to find, that essence that's unique to each of us. It's both we're all interconnected, but also we're all here to shine with our own unique flavor of yumminess in the world. And of course, it's not a one and done thing. It's like always a journey for all of us. But that's kind of what I meant by that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Curious what that's like for you or what you were thinking.
Yeah, I think for me, what I've seen is time and time again, the place where I'm hurting or wounded or the limiting belief that shows up to stop me, that when I'm willing to get curious with it, when I'm willing to look at where that came from or what it's doing for me to keep it, that inquiry starts to unravel the wounding and starts to make space for a new kind of wholeness to emerge there. And I think that is like the deep purpose of therapy, of healing modalities, is to be willing to be held and supported to look at those very uncomfortable places, whether it's like a serious trauma event or memory or experience that you're unwinding, or whether it's just a sticky way of being that you can't seem to find your way out of, that you're not sure what it's about yet. That being an inquiry with that, especially with support of somebody who's, specializes in unpacking that with you, can be a really rapid, compared to doing it alone, can be really a fast track way to step into more of your potency, step into more of your like power and joy and ease in your life. And I think, in my opinion, there is no work more worth doing than uncovering those sticky places and finding that, like you said, yumminess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And I think for me, it's really the curiosity and the openness and really starting to shift shame, which I think so much of the wounding, the stickiness of the wounding is often really just shame. Societal shame, internalized shame, all of it. And so when we start shifting from shame into just compassion for the humanity of it, for those parts, for the ancestors, that's where the excitement can come in. And then it doesn't have to feel so heavy. It can actually be exciting. And I think we're lucky that we live in an era where, we have access to healers, and that's a possibility. And I think through these two women's journeys, I showed, both with the contemporary story of how Sarah shifted with the help of her therapist, and she also did hypnotherapy, which isn't a modality that I do, but it is one that I received, including to get closer to my characters, and it worked amazingly well. But with Maggie, we see her really also going through this whole transformation. And because it's in the 1910s and 20s and there wasn't therapy at the time, she's doing it through kind of channeling messages from nature and the universe and her friends and people reflecting things back to her. And so it is also possible to heal and transform in lots of different ways. It's really just about pausing and listening and trusting, learning to trust also inner voices and inner knowing.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it's that lie that's out there that I am this way, or it is the way that it is, that is like a conclusion or a limitation that holds us hostage. And when we start looking at, does this work for me? Or is this a way of being I want to keep continuing, and get curious with that it can change. And yeah, I love what you said. There's so many ways that wisdom can come to us, and that healing can be received by us or enacted by us or invited. And yeah, the main thing I think is to be with it, be curious with it. And I love that focus on, how do I find compassion for me, or compassion for where this came from, or compassion for the world at large as it's creating scenarios like this. There's so much freedom in that.
Absolutely. And disidentification from the stories we're telling ourselves, both about ourselves and also about others, I think is also where kind of play and stepping into things that served us at some point. And I think that honoring is really important, to be able to honor the wisdom in the strategies and the stories, but also how, when they last longer than the circumstances we were in do, they just kind of keep us trapped in that. And so then starting to be able to find freedom from that, honor the emotions without going into story, we can really step into those kind of bigger versions of ourselves.
Yeah, which is exciting and fun.
It's so exciting and fun. Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think one of the things I wanted to convey through Sarah's story is how sometimes, even when something is like very close to our essential self, like we're feeling called to serve others, we might do it in a way that's also escaping from difficulty. And, in her case, she was doing humanitarian nursing work because she felt called to it, but it was also a way of like never settling down, not really like having to have roots, not having to face any of the things that were traumatic for her growing up. So it became a running away and an escape, even though it was doing something meaningful. And when she stopped and started clearing those wounds and started relearning how to not be so afraid of stillness, she was able to express pretty much the same thing in the world, still being someone who's here to serve, but in a way that was also honoring her to shine in the best way possible rather than being an escape. And so I think that for many of us, that's the case. We might be drawn to doing things that are really part of our purpose, but in a way that's keeping us trapped in old patterns.
Yeah, I see this all day long with my clients. Yes. I preach about this quite often. Yes. Yeah, and the lie is that if I self-abandon in my expression of being in service, that I will be able to serve more. And that's that's the fallacy, that the truth is when you are resourced, when you are honored, when you are cared for, when you are given space and time to breathe and pause, you can actually show up and serve so much greater, which is that, pouring from a full cup metaphor, or, bringing water up from a well that has water in it, whatever the metaphor is, that you're able to bring more of yourself to the table when you are not running yourself ragged. And that takes the capacity to shift from that self-abandonment to that self-honoring. And yeah, that's one of the biggest things that I do with my clients too, is how do we cultivate this self-honoring, this self-compassion, this taking time and space to repattern the mind that says you have to go, go, go to get anywhere, instead of actually I could go further if I paused here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And for me, the entry point is often going to that child who learned to self-abandon and use their beautiful gifts, often of, at least for my clients, of high sensitivity, because that's, I'm a highly sensitive person as well. So I often attract that. But, when for whatever reason as children we're not completely attuned to, we end up learning to use those gifts to attune to others, and kind of abandoning ourselves. And we learn this either or of self or other. And so at that time, it's often a pretty wise way of feeling less powerless, of like hoping that maybe at some point we'll get our needs met. But so then, it's about really honoring that child's decision, but then creating the bridge between then and now to realize that we have so many resources and choices we didn't have then. And so can we really start shifting that? Because yeah, ultimately, if I'm abandoning myself, like nobody's going to be served by it.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and I think
Definitely.
hopefully that comes through in the book too.
Well, we are going to find out, because I'm sure a lot of people out there listening are excited to go and read this story of Maggie and Sarah. Now, we're going to have you back on the show, Jenny, and talk more about your work and the transformation that you help your clients create and choose and step into and allow, expand, have, whatever. So we'll
All
have
great
another
words.
episode. If anyone's out there, make sure you subscribe to the show so you catch the next episode with Jenny Brav. But in the meantime, what's the best way for people to follow along on your journey, get more of your wisdom, and get access to your book? What are the best places for people to go and do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my book, The Unbroken Horizon, is available either on my writer's websites. I have two websites, but I'll be talking more about the healer one in the leader show. So my writer's website is just my name, Jenny Brav with a Y, Jenny, Jenny, Brav.com. And also on Amazon, there are two different pages. So if you fall on one and it doesn't have the format you want, because there's one page for the hardback, one page for paperback, there's Kindles on both. But Amazon, it's also on, if you don't want to buy on Amazon, which I know a lot of people don't, it's on every single platform, especially the Kindle and the hardback. Barnes and Noble, like all independent bookstores, also carry the one of the Kindles and the hardback. So whatever version you want, it's available. And also, I would love more reviews for it to be able to get out there even more. If you read it and love it, leave a review. But I think those are the main ones. It's on Goodreads. I am on Twitter now, X, as a writer. But I think my website, I also have a monthly newsletter with poetry and other writings that come through me.
Awesome. Well, we'll put the link, jennybrav.com, in the show notes of this episode so people can get easy access to that. And you've shared so much beauty and wisdom already. Are there any last words of wisdom you want to leave people with for this episode?
No, just that I see the wholeness and the beauty and the light in all of you. And if you do pick up the book, I hope it inspires you on your own journey of healing for yourself, and also what you're bringing in the world to others, because I see it and I feel it.
Yes. Awesome. Love that. Thank you so much for being on the show, Jenny.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And thank you everyone out there for listening. I hope you get a chance to go read The Unbroken Horizon and give a review for it wherever you bought it from. So Jenny has more testimonials about the book. And whatever happens, keep asking big questions and taking bold action because you are here for a reason. We'll see you next time.